Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. I'm guessing that in grade school at some point you played the game of telephone. You know, that game where you and your classmates or friends get in a circle and one person whispers a statement to the next person, and it continues like that until it gets back to the original person. And we all remember the results. The statement is generally so distorted that everyone in the circle starts laughing, which is funny as a controlled game when there are no consequences. But it is terrifying in the real world when the information is necessary and may have life or death consequences. The bottom line is this: we need shared facts to thrive, and sometimes we need those shared facts just to survive. I mean, can you imagine if a large segment of the population was told by seemingly credible sources that red traffic lights meant go and green traffic lights meant stop? It would be catastrophic. There would likely be thousands of unnecessary deaths. And today, disinformation can do such things, and many of us are discouraged by the fact that it's on the rise. Why does it exist, and why do people perpetuate it? And more important, what can be done about it? Fortunately, I know just the guy to ask. My guest, Eric Schurenberg, is editor-in-chief of Amplify Publishing Group and the former CEO and editor-in-chief of two major publications, Inc. magazine and Fast Company. He has taken great interest in fake news and disinformation. We talk about these troubling issues, and as you'll hear, Eric is highly personable and analytical, making it easy to follow his thinking. His experience at the highest levels of journalism qualifies him as the person to address these issues, and I hope you'll find his words edifying and empowering. So listen in as Eric talks about fake news, why it's here, and what can be done about it. Eric Schurenberg, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
I am so much a fan of your work. Before we get into the various topics, whether it's working at Inc. magazine, Fast Company, or anything else, let's just get a little bit of your backstory before we get into this meat, because I think the backstory is actually meat.
Okay, so the backstory starts in Cincinnati, Ohio, a place that has, in the years since I left there, alternately warmed my heart and embarrassed the shit out of me. It is a great place to grow up. It is a great place to be able to reflect back on, but it has moments that sometimes make me wonder how I came out of that place and became the person I am. There have been a number of sort of embarrassing people to come out of there. Pete Rose, for example, Charlie Hustle, but was a terrible role model, even though he was the hero of anyone who rooted for the Cincinnati Reds. Marge Schott, who owned sports teams there, but had said a number of very unwise, racist things over the course of her career, even though many of the athletes who worked for her were Black. Cincinnati has censored artists, and at the same time, it is beautifully situated on hills overlooking the Ohio River. It has a wonderful symphony and quite accomplished theater, a regional theater. It carries all the contradictions that our country carries right now.
And then you ran Inc. magazine as well as Fast Company, two phenomenal publications. What are some of the surprising things that maybe those of us who can't imagine that life, what were some of the surprising aspects that maybe we couldn't imagine that were part of your life as CEO of those two great publications?
Well, let me distinguish first between the two publications. They're both business publications with a kind of overlay of entrepreneurship and technology, but they serve quite different. So you sort of had to understand what an Inc. story was versus a Fast Company story. Inc. is targeted at business owners. And so the range of businesses that might be covered by that umbrella term could be people who have rolled up a whole bunch of dentists' offices or lawn services, as well as entrepreneurs creating artificial intelligence. And the goal there was to help those business owners cope with the pressures of being the person where the buck stops, the person responsible for meeting payroll every couple of weeks. And as journalists, it was incumbent on us to make it clear that we understood how difficult a job that was and that we appreciated them. And, not every entrepreneur goes on to be a Silicon Valley lion, mogul. Many of them labor in general obscurity, and yet they're the ones who create jobs in this economy. They're the ones who take the risks that make the economy go forward. And so it was important to recognize them. That was very rewarding because when you're a small business owner, you generally don't rise above the horizon in the press, but Inc. recognized those owners and they appreciated that. Fast Company, on the other hand, was targeted at executives who were searching for something out of their workplace that was not what they learned in business school, meaning a sense of progressive altruism, I guess you would say. But the politics of Fast Company were clearly progressive on the left side of the political spectrum. But what the readers of Fast Company were searching for was a sense that their career advanced the good of the world, of humanity. So stories that were about companies that were advancing diversity and equity, environmental consciousness, resolving income inequality, as well as advancing the frontiers of technology. All of this was sort of squarely in the target zone for Fast Company. And that was also extremely interesting. Fast Company also had a large element devoted to design and creativity. It had a large beachhead in those communities, though Hollywood and fashion and design, industrial design in general. So that also made the coverage of Fast Company particularly interesting to audiences that might not have been sort of totally focused on management and so forth.
Fantastic. And let's fast forward to where you are now. You've taken on this Herculean task of informing the public about disinformation and trying to address fake news and other sources of disinformation. Can you share a little bit about how you got into that and what you're doing?
The moment of truth, Adam, arrived for me one time when I came off stage after being on a panel before an audience of entrepreneurs from Cincinnati, as it turned out. And as I left the stage, feeling that I had even more than usually articulate and witty and learned and feeling kind of really full of myself, a woman came up to me and I expected her to say some gushy thing that I felt like I deserved about how clever you are or whatever. And instead she said, "Why do you journalists always lie?" And I felt in that moment that the world is bigger than the bubble that I live in. And to her, the work I do just did not reach her. And she had been kind of swept into the worldview that saw people like me as willingly telling untruth. And at that moment, I just felt like this whole misinformation, disinformation thing is not a joke anymore. And it's a threat to my profession. It's clearly a divisive thing in our democracy. And it seemed like the most important work that my generation could tackle. And so that's what I began to do. I started a podcast with one of the leading experts on disinformation, Joan Donovan of Harvard, and continue that podcast to this day, trying to elevate the work of people who are on the front lines of restoring a shared sense of reality and elevating truth and fighting disinformation. I've also started, which is very much in the early stages of a project, a not-for-profit project aimed at helping journalists deal with questions of trust. So what is it that we in the profession do that engenders suspicion? How can we counteract that with the way we cover the news, the way we interact with our audiences and our sources? And what is it about our business models that seem to make people not trust us? What can we do that will make our business sustainable, but also not erode trust? That's called the Newsroom Trust Project. And I've raised a very healthy seed round and I'm talking to partners now about how to insert that and bring journalists from newsrooms into a learning process where we can cover these issues and create a body of practice that will help restore, I hope, the plummeting level of trust that Americans have in professional media.
Wow, so important. And just the mere premise of the question, why do you journalists always lie? I mean, there's really no way to even answer the question. It's built on a premise that all journalists always lie. Their question itself is so problematic. And I'm absolutely a believer in truthful reporting. That being said, could you just share from your vantage point why the truth is so important? As stupid of a question as this is going to sound, I want to hear from your vantage point, though, why this is such an important battle.
Well, it's pretty clear that if you don't have a shared sense of reality, a common canon of facts, if you will, we can't make decisions as a nation about the things that we need to do to solve the problems we face. If it's not clear that, to take a recent example of something of huge importance, if we can't agree whether there is such a thing as a COVID pandemic, it's going to be very hard for us to save lives. And I think that we demonstrated that at the cost of 1 million American lives. It's one thing to say that we believe in facts and the other side doesn't believe in facts. And that is an easy way out. The other sort of epistemological mistake people can make is that there is no truth and everyone just is entitled to their own truth. That also leads you to chaos. Where I would like us to go is, and journalism can play a role in this, is making it clear that truth is a sometimes elusive thing, and that our quest for simple answers is sometimes a very unwise thing to pursue, that we should be willing to accept nuance and uncertainty. There's nothing wrong with that. And that people who disagree with us, even if we are convinced they're wrong, are generally not acting out of malice or evil. They just have a different point of view. And there's generally a grain of truth, a grain of factuality behind what they believe, even if you're convinced it's wrong. I think that we in the journalism profession too easily resort to bicoastal arrogance about our superior knowledge. We're too quick to categorize people. And also, I think that we assume that our audiences understand what we do and how we do it better than they actually do. And we're not aware of the things we do that make people not trust us. One example, which is mind-blowing for those of us in the profession, is that many people think that anonymous sources, when they're quoted in the professional media, means that we're quoting people who are anonymous to us, that we're just quoting someone who could be anybody. If that's what you think, you can see why that would seem to be totally
I went to the
illegitimate.
local 7-Eleven. A guy was buying a Snickers. I asked him his opinion, and he's remaining anonymous.
Yes, that's right. I have no idea who he is. However,
I don't know who he is. It's a total,
let me tell you what he thinks about
his credibility is
Ukraine.
It's questionable at best.
Just that sort of thing. It's mind-boggling, but they're not journalists. And I'm sure that there are plenty of things that I don't understand about plumbing or automotive mechanics. And I probably make assumptions that would be wrong. And I think I'd benefit from someone if I needed to really consume those services. And occasionally I do. I'd like to know more about what they do.
It's amazing the ripple effect of an unshared taxonomy of facts and how it can cause one person to go one way and the other person to go the other way. And we know, united we stand, divided we fall. So there's so many issues that misinformation can generate. I'm wondering, what are some of the perhaps surprising consequences of misinformation or disinformation?
Well, what I would say, apart from the polarization that we see, is the hold that the narratives that we like to tell about ourselves and about others have over us and the motivations that drive them. One of the sources that I had on my podcast, in reality, talked about, he was working at the Duke University Polarization Lab, and he talked about one of the subjects of his study. Meeting the person in person, he was, as my guest described, the most gentlemanly, kindly, polite person you could imagine, friendly and forthcoming. His online persona was vicious and cruel and delighted in creating violent images of Democratic figureheads being violently attacked. And as he examined what was going on, the researcher realized that for this guy, that kind of imagery that he would put online was important for him for gaining status within his group of conservative extremists. So that was his tribe. And doing this kind of over-the-top, vicious social media posting was important to him for his self-esteem and his standing within the group. The dichotomy between the online persona and the in-person persona was so stark that the researchers double and triple checked that it was the same guy. Having met him, they could not believe it.
Couldn't reconcile these two images of the same guy.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things. We are tribal in ways that run very deep and we're not even aware of it. Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning psychologist, just talked a lot about the mental shortcuts we use that lead us astray. And I think that anyone approaching news, anyone seeking the truth and factuality just needs to be aware of that's what they bring to the party. We all bring these mental shortcuts that make us unusually susceptible to being seduced by untruth.
And as a psychologist, I'd like to weigh in for a second. Danny Kahneman's work has really informed me as a person and as a thinker. He describes two systems of thinking that you're referring to. System one being the things that we can answer quickly, like what is 1 + 1? We don't need to think. We shouldn't need to think because our brains need to not think about simple things in order to be productive. But sometimes when we're asked a tougher question that requires more thinking and we use a system one approach for a more complex problem, like a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? And everyone says 10 cents. It doesn't matter if you are a genius or not. 90% of Harvard students or more got this wrong. And it's actually $1.05 and 5. That's $1 difference. And when we address a complex problem with simplistic thinking, we end up in major trouble. And I think one of the things that's really made this country so great and countries in general so great is the ability to do exactly what you just described, be able to think deeply, examine the nuances, not just go with your first gut response, but really, really deeply consider. And I'm guessing that you as a journalist were constantly rocking the system two approach to think about things more deeply so that you could render your best rendering of the truth.
That is what journalism does when it's working well. It doesn't always work well. It's a human institution and there are failings and there are perverse incentives that we need to be aware of and fight against. One of them is simply the desire to seem smarter than the average bear and to write stories for your peers rather than for your actual audience. And one of the things that I found myself doing with some regularity was, quite apart from factuality in the story, was the tone. And it was important to bring journalists back to a certain humility towards their subject and towards the truth and have them admit nuance and have them wield the power that a large audience and the backing of a recognized media institution gives you. So wield that power responsibly and remember that you can affect people's lives for good or for evil by the way you tell a story. So those are the things that drag journalists away from that ideal of total fealty to objective truth.
As you're laying this out for me, and when I think about disinformation, misinformation, I'm overwhelmed by the game of whack-a-mole that we're constantly playing to address like the ripple effects of things that aren't true. And I find myself thinking also about that great line from Leo DiCaprio in Inception. Now I'm going to paraphrase it, but the most durable thing in the universe is an idea. And I love that concept. I mean, I'm aware that there are certain metals that probably outlast certain ideas, but it really speaks to the fact that when we put something in someone's head or a large group of people's head, that these things, it goes on like a game of telephone and it can just get distorted and more distorted and more distorted over time. I find myself overwhelmed. And you who've sat with this problem in ways that very few people have, I'm wondering if you were given the tools to deal with misinformation and you were given total freedom to exercise them, what would those tools be?
I think the most important tool is transparency. So to let the audience know, whatever your audience is, whether it's your followers in TikTok or Facebook or Twitter, or whether it's your audience for, The Atlantic or Fox News, is what are the motivations that you may have? It's maybe a bit much for a journalist to admit to biases, but you can have a statement of best practices. You can be clear about how you're funded, about how you handle advertising. And in social media, I think you can be clear too about where your sources come from and how reliable they are and what your orientation is towards something. So transparency, I think, is a really key tool. When it comes to content moderation, the sort of whack-a-mole exercise that you just referred to, I think it's really important for the social media platforms to explain how and why they enforce their content moderation policies. So for example, that the reason, just to take a prominent example, that some people might be kicked off a platform is that the policy is that you can't say things that target a single person or threaten them with violence. And here's how this post or this thread violated that. Or another prominent example these days too would be the coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop. Again, it's one thing to decide whether or not to cover that immediately. And many mainstream publications chose not to, but it was necessary, I think, to explain why, and also to be clear about in what ways you found, if you chose not to cover it, as many did, why you found the story to be, as it was presented originally, kind of suspicious and needed more verification before going public with a story.
Brilliant. Is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
One question that I'd like to answer is whether I think this situation is hopeless or not.
Please.
And I think that a lot of us are in despair about the state of the information ecosystem. It seems that people spreading lies have the advantage over people trying to get at the truth. Lies travel faster, as it has been well documented, and partly because they're so emotionally evocative and people are eager to share them. Plus, you don't have to do too much consideration if you're making something up or don't care whether something you're sharing is true or not. Whereas trying to get at the truth is a slow process, and it takes work to examine all of the possible explanations for something that would be true or could not be true, to make sure that you're not leaping to conclusions and things like that. So yeah, it's evident that misinformation, conspiracy theories and things like that have captured a large portion of the US electorate. But I do think that in the end, truth will have to win. And I think that because truth has one enormous advantage in the world of ideas is that it actually describes the real world, works. Falsehoods cannot put a rover on Mars or create a vaccine that solves a deadly disease. You cannot unite a country around falsehood. So I think that in the end, people will see that the only thing that matches to their own experience of lived reality is the truth. And that they will see, for example, that their neighbors who have different politics are not evil or stupid or all the things that social media says when it stereotypes the other. And, if we can make it through to that point, we'll be back to a state where we have an accepted set of facts that we can start to work from to solve the problems that we face.
I think about the idea of hot goss. I've got some hot goss for you. You're not going to believe it, but Elvis Presley is alive and well. And that used to be a funny headline when I was walking out of the supermarket, looking at the rags that were less than reputable, that were touting such stuff. But it's really problematic when they are things that actually matter in our lives, like the COVID thing that you described, like butchering our leaders and impaling them with ideas that are absolutely patently untrue. Why do you think? You kind of referenced that we all want to seem smart. Distorted things travel really fast because they're so tantalizing. What would you say is causing people to comport themselves in this way where they are just perpetuating non-truths?
I think there are a lot of reasons, Adam. That is a difficult question. There's a sense of resentment and disempowerment. And when you feel that the world is passing you by, the people in power don't care about you, you are more susceptible to conspiracy theories. And when you see things that you don't understand or you think are wrong, the natural tendency is to attribute bad intention to the actors who are behind them. Even if you were to make the same mistake, you would say that your intentions were good. Then you'd give yourself a break, but you tend not to, just by human nature, extend that grace to other people. So I think that some combination of people feeling out of the loop, not empowered, looked down on by people in power who have the glamour and the money and the education, just creates a fertile ground for dissatisfaction and imputing evil intent. And of course, that feeling is fed by a number of entrepreneurs who realize that by playing to that negative emotion, they can garner large audiences and then sell them advertising or survivalist tools or guns. And I think that is what we're dealing with. What the solution is finally to realize that we're all sort of in this American project together, and that in private, most of us actually agree about what the most important aspirations for our country are. And to acknowledge that is an important first step, I think, to bringing us to a shared reality.
As I hear you speak, we all have a fundamental need to be seen. We all want a seat at the table. We all want to feel significant. And it's such a powerful weapon to weaponize information and make it tantalizing. And I would think that fear, just based on my knowledge of human behavior as well as our neuroanatomies, which resides in the amygdala, kind of an almond-shaped thing around our, kind of closer to our ear, than our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for that kind of system 2 thinking that allows us to plan and really consider, think, and rethink again, to borrow kind of a concept from the great Adam Grant, who wrote my favorite book of last year, which was Think Again. And it's kind of a perfect storm. Just that kind of combination of fear wins, anger wins, and we all want to be known and seen, and we all want to be seen as intelligent. I remember interviewing David McNary, who writes a lot about cognitive bias, and he talks about the idea that when it comes to our sense of how we're perceived, we would rather go down with the Titanic and leave our reputations in the lifeboats. We'd rather die physically than be seen as someone whose reputation is somewhat tarnished. So it's just a perfect storm, and you are countering it with your intelligence and guessing you're engaging other people to help this really good fight to make sure that we can keep the truth alive, which is something I never thought I would say in my lifetime. So I got to ask you my final question, and I'm just beyond grateful for you sharing your experience and your wisdom. Here's the big one. Eric, if you had the magical powers to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve the lives of people, what would that skill or insight be? And how do you imagine it would impact the individual as well as society at large?
I think the answer is easy from where I sit right now, Adam. I think that magic wand would, if I wielded it, ideally it would create empathy. So understanding among people, that be able to see other people for what they are, to understand where they're coming from, to recognize that most of the time people's intentions are good and they see themselves as good and want to create the same things that all of us want, of peace and beauty and friendship and love. And that when you can see the humanity in other people on the other side of some tribal divide, it just becomes really hard to hate them. So that's it. I think the superpower that I would love to endow the world with is empathy.
You know, as I'm hearing you, my brain is going all kinds of places, including the idea that truth is so fundamental to empathy. It's so fundamental to love. It's paradoxically, it's exactly what the people who are perpetuating stories that they know themselves to not be true, if they just had a little more love, they probably wouldn't do that, a little more empathy. And I think about this rabbi who befriended a former grand wizard, or I forget, some type of cyclops in the KKK or the neo-Nazis. He basically wrote a letter saying, it seems like you need a little bit of love and you're not getting any. I have some, let's hang out. And they became best friends. Of course, the guy who was, in the hate group left the hate group, and really was what he wanted was empathy and love. And so what he was doing was he had become a monster. So here's to you using the pen, mightier than the sword, and using your experience and intelligence and connections to help create a better world for me and my children. I'm so grateful to you. And this has been a blast, Eric.
Adam, it's a real pleasure. Thanks.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.